What changes when a leader is no longer leading from capacity, but from pressure? Not when the work becomes important. Leadership work is often important, not when the stakes become high. Leadership sometimes requires high stakes decisions. What happens when the demands keep rising, the conditions keep changing, and the leader becomes the last remaining buffer between a system under strain and the people it serves? Do they still have enough attention to distinguish urgent from merely loud? Enough judgment to make a thoughtful decision rather than simply a fast one? Enough margin to communicate clearly, ask for help, and recognize what can no longer be carried the same way? Or does the pressure begin making decisions on their behalf? Welcome to the Human Capacity Sit Rep. In today's episode, we are on episode 5. SITREP, if you're new here, SITREP is short for Situation Report. This is not a partisan news recap, and it is not a prediction show. This is where we look beneath the headlines and ask, what human capacity challenge is this event creating, and what does responsible leadership require? I'm Dr. Kim Hires, and today's question is simple. What happens to leadership when demand outruns capacity? By the end of this episode, you will be able to recognize how escalating demands affect leadership, decision making, and identify one responsibility you can delegate, delay, or discontinue before pressure turns it into a larger problem. Now, before we begin today's episode, a brief recording note. The Human Capacity SITREP is built around current events, and conditions may change between the time this episode is recorded and the time you hear it. So at the time of this recording, Washington remains under a statewide wildfire emergency following devastating fires that displaced thousands and destroyed hundreds of homes and other structures. In the United States, temporary protection status for Haitians has been terminated, affecting hundreds of thousands of people and creating workforce consequences for employers and communities. And global trade continues to expand, but unevenly, as higher prices and geopolitical uncertainty reshape supply chains and operating assumptions. The details of these stories may continue to evolve, but the capacity patterns we are examining do not. And before you decide that one of these stories has nothing to do with you because you do not live in Washington, or you do not employ anyone affected by Haitian TPS, or your organization does not directly participate in global trade, I want you to resist that instinct. Responsible leaders pay attention before an issue reaches their front door. You may lead an organization in New York and never experience a wildfire in Washington, but what would a major disruption in your region expose about your staffing model, your continuity plans, your communication systems, or your ability to adjust expectations quickly? You may not currently employ anyone affected by the termination of Haitian TPS, but if your workforce includes employees whose ability to work could be affected by immigration or employment policy changes, do you know where the vulnerability exists? Do you know what work would be disrupted? Do you know what your organization would do next? And you may never personally negotiate an international trade agreement, but your vendors, technology, materials, customers, transportation, networks, energy costs, or supply chain may be connected to decisions being made thousands of miles away. Distance from an event does not guarantee insulation from its consequences. That is why responsible leadership requires more than reacting to what is directly in front of you. Leaders have to learn to look backward, outward, and forward while managing what is happening now. Backward, what history created the conditions we are operating in. Outward, what is changing in the systems around us. Now, what does that mean for the people and work we are responsible for today and forward? If this continues or something similar happens here, what might we need to do next? Leadership is not prediction, it is preparedness informed by attention. You will not anticipate everything. That is not the standard. The standard is whether you are paying enough attention to recognize consequential change before it becomes an organizational emergency. Because organizations do not exist in a vacuum. They operate inside complex economic systems, political systems, communities, labor markets, healthcare systems, technologies, supply chains, families, and environments. And eventually, what happens in those systems finds its way into the organization. That is why these stories belong in a leadership conversation. Wildfire, immigration policy, global trade. Three very different headlines, but each requires leaders to make consequential decisions in conditions they did not create and cannot fully control. That is leadership under pressure. Let's begin with a framework from the Human Capacity Advantage System. Capacity load alignment. Capacity load alignment is the degree to which the demands a person or system is carrying are reasonably matched by the resources available to meet them. Capacity load includes more than talent and effort. It includes the cognitive, emotional, physical, relational, professional, behavioral, and adaptive resources available to respond well. And load includes more than task. It includes urgency, ambiguity, volume, consequences, competing priorities, disruptions, decisions, and the invisible work of holding other people steady. Pressure increases when load rises faster than capacity can be protected, restored, or expanded. And when that happens, leaders don't simply become busier, their decision environment changes. The thoughtful leader can become reactive. The communicative team can begin withholding information because everyone is trying to keep up. The organization that values strategy can slowly reduce leadership to one operational emergency after another. We glorify action oriented, but I often find myself when I'm consulting with an organization going, hey, slow down. You're building the airplane mid flight over and over and over again. This does not excuse harmful behavior or poor decisions. It explains why leadership systems must account for capacity before strain becomes visible as mistakes, conflict, turnover, missed signals, or burnout. And here's the distinction I want you to remember. Pressure is not proof that a leader is failing, but refusing to adjust the load when pressure is persistent is a leadership failure. Our first situation comes from Washington State. At the time of this recording, Washington remains under a statewide wildfire emergency. The devastating Spokane area fires that began early this month forced tens of thousands of people to evacuate and destroyed hundreds of structures. Firefighters have since made substantial containment progress on several of those fires, but wildfire impacts continue across the state. The visible headline is Wildfire. The leadership story is Compound Demand. When an emergency affects multiple systems simultaneously, leaders are not managing one problem, they are managing the interaction among problems. Employees may be dealing with displacement, property loss, smoke exposure, family safety, childcare disruption, transportation problems, or interrupted services. At the same time, organizations may be dealing with staffing gaps, closures, power interruptions, altered delivery routes, displaced customers, and continuity decisions. And somewhere in the middle sits a manager trying to maintain normal performance expectations when the conditions required for normal performance no longer exist. This is where a human capacity lens changes the question. The conventional question may be, how do we keep the operation running? Mm-mm. What operating assumptions must change now that the conditions have changed? Maybe shifts change. Maybe remote work becomes available where the work allows. Maybe attendance or travel expectations change. Maybe output targets change. Maybe something simply doesn't get done this week. Because when leaders refuse to adjust the expectation, the difference doesn't disappear. Someone absorbs it. And usually that someone has less authority than the person who decided the expectation should remain unchanged. That is why leadership under pressure requires recognizing when persistence is no longer resilience. Sometimes persistence is simply prolonged exposure to an unsustainable condition. Our second situation comes from U.S. immigration policy. At the time of this recording, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services stated that temporary protected status for Haitian citizens was terminated effective July 27, 2026. TPS allowed eligible Haitian nationals to live and work in the United States temporarily while designated conditions made return unsafe. It is important to be precise. This does not mean every Haitian person in the United States now has the same immigration status or employment outcome. Some individuals may have another lawful immigration status or another basis for employment authorization. But for workers whose authorization depended on Haitian TPS and for employers that relied on their labor, the change is consequential. The human stakes come first. People are navigating uncertainty about employment, income, family, stability, immigration status, and what happens next. And those realities enter the workplace. There is also an organizational capacity consequence: healthcare, direct care, hospitality, restaurants, hotels, small businesses. Organizations in sectors already struggling with workforce availability can lose experienced workers while the work itself remains. When people leave a system, their workload does not automatically leave with them. Someone still has to care for the patients, support the residents, prepare the rooms, serve the guests, cover the shifts, complete the work. And if leaders don't deliberately redistribute, reduce, or redesign that work, the system redistributes it for them, usually onto the people who remain. This is what leaders sometimes miss. A decision does not have to originate inside your organization to fundamentally change the capacity available inside your organization. Policy enters the workplace, economics enters the workplace, global events enter the workplace. Human beings carry those systems through the front door. One of the most painful things someone can say is leave your personal lives at the door. It's just not possible. That is why business cannot be understood in isolation from the society in which it operates. Responsible capacity stewardship does not require an organization to solve immigration policy. It requires leaders to deal honestly with the operational reality in front of them. Where will the work go? Who is being asked to absorb it? What workload, schedule, service level, or priority needs to be changed? And how do we make lawful operational decisions while preserving human dignity? You cannot promise that leaders will never operate under pressure, but you can refuse to build a leadership model that depends on people being superhuman or invisible. Our third situation is global trade. The latest UN Trade and Development Update reports that global trade continued to expand strongly during the first half of 2026, but that expansion has been increasingly uneven. Global goods trade was estimated at approximately $13.7 trillion during the first half of the year, up 12.5% from the same period in 2025. But part of that increase reflects higher prices rather than simply more goods moving through the global economy. Energy, transportation, logistics, and production costs have been affected by geopolitical disruption, and geopolitical uncertainty continues to reshape supply chains and trade relationships. For a leader, that global headline may arrive looking much smaller. It may look like a procurement problem, a pricing conversation, a vendor decision, a delayed shipment, a revised forecast, another exception requiring approval, another decision that cannot wait. The headline sounds like economics. The human capacity story is decision density. Density decision occurs when an increasing number of choices, exceptions, trade offs, and approvals are compressed into the same limited period of time. A leader may be asked to protect margins, retain customers, stabilize employees, communicate with the board, respond to suppliers, and make decisions with incomplete information, while still doing the ordinary work of running the business. The problem isn't simply that leaders have more decisions to make. Every additional consequential decision communicates for the same finite attention, judgment, and adaptive capacity. The title hasn't changed. The job description may not have changed, but the capacity required to perform the role well has. This is why a job description is never a complete measure of a role's capacity demands. Two leaders can hold the same title and carry radically different loads depending on volatility, resources, support, team capability, market conditions, and the number of consequential decisions flowing toward them. When organizations ignore that reality, they often do one of two things. They celebrate the leader who absorbs everything until the person has nothing left to give, or they criticize the leader whose performance changes without asking what changed in the system around them. Neither is responsible leadership. Now place the three situations together. Wildfire gives us compound demand. TPS gives us capacity disruption and workload redistribution. Global trade gives us decision density. Different headlines, same underlying problem. Load accumulation, more variables, more decisions, more consequences, less time, less predictability, and too often, less margin. This is where leaders have to become precise. When load rises, do not automatically ask people to work harder. That seems to be the go to response. It's wrong. First, ask what can change, what can be delegated, what can be delayed, what can be discontinued, and what support must be added because the conditions have changed. Capacity load alignment does not require leaders to eliminate pressure. It requires leaders to stop treating pressure as a neutral and constant condition because pressure has consequences. It affects attention, judgment, patience, communication, creativity, relationships, and eventually the ability to see beyond the next fire. Here is your capacity practice. Identify one leadership responsibility that is currently consuming more capacity than it should. Be specific. Maybe it's a standing meeting that no longer produces a decision, a report no one uses, a task you continue performing because you haven't developed someone else to do it, a project that has lost strategic importance, a conflict you're allowing to remain ambiguous, or an expectation that needs to be renegotiated before it becomes a crisis. Then choose one of three actions: delegate it, delay it, or discontinue it. Delegation is not abandonment. It is the intentional transfer of responsibility with the clarity, authority, and support required for someone else to carry it. Delay is not denial. It is a conscious decision to sequence work according to what matters most now. And discontinuation is not laziness. It is the leadership discipline of recognizing when a demand no longer deserves the capacity it consumes. Leadership is not only deciding what gets done, leadership is deciding what no longer gets to consume the system. So choose one. Take action this week because you cannot create capacity by wishing for more of it. You create capacity by changing the relationship between the load and the resources available to carry it. The headlines tell us what happened. The human capacity lens helps us see what people are being asked to carry before it happened. Leadership under pressure is not measured by how much a single person can endure. It is measured by whether you can see the load clearly enough to change it before the load changes the people carrying it. That is not soft leadership. That is operational leadership. And that's it. If today's conversation resonated with you, subscribe and share this episode with someone who would benefit from it. You can continue the conversation with me and my team at thenightingalefirm.com. New episodes of the Human Capacity Advantage podcast are released every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Monday, the Monday Morning Capacity Check prepares you to approach the week with greater awareness and intention. On Wednesday, our main classroom episode develops your understanding of the research, workplace realities, and leadership practices in the Human Capacity Advantage system. And on Friday, the Human Capacity Sit Rep teaches you to look beneath the headlines, recognize the capacity challenges shaping our world, and consider what responsible leadership requires. Monday prepares you, Wednesday develops you, and Friday teaches you to see the world differently. Between now and our next class, pay attention to the world around you. Notice where human capacity is being strengthened, where it is being depleted, and where you may never have thought to look before. I'm Dr. Kim Hires. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, class dismissed.